Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you here. My name is Julio Dávila. I'm a professor of urban policy and international development at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, also known as DPU. And I'm really happy to be here with you all, and particularly with Professors Le-Yin, Zhang, and Fulong. This is a fantastic occasion because it not only brings our two departments within the Bartlett together, but it's also a joyous occasion to, in a way, launch informally their books. They're both prolific writers. They're both very good. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. They're both prolific writers. They're both very well-known international scholars of China, more particularly urban China. More about that later. But also it shows the kind of themes that we deal with in both the Development Planning Unit at DPU and in Bartlett School of Planning. So it's a real pleasure to welcome them here and have this dialogue. This is if you like, an initiative from a research cluster at the DPU called the State and Market Cluster. So we organize at DPU our research into 4 different clusters. And this is an initiative out of that. We initially thought within the cluster that we would talk about decentralization in China. And then we thought, well, maybe that's not so interesting. We would talk about the state and the market in China. And then in dialogue with these two, they said, well, maybe this is a bit narrow. I do intend to, at some point, sort of elicit a little bit of those themes out of our 2 speakers today. But of course, what they're doing, what we've asked them to do is to talk about their books. Books are both available. Le-Yin's book is called Conducting and Financing Low Carbon Transitions in China, a Governmentality Perspective. I can't even pronounce it like and it's an Edward Elgar book. It's available online through the library. And Fulong's, I don't have a copy of it here, unfortunately. My copy is only digital. I have so many books, and it's not because I don't want to spend money in books. I have so many books I don't have anywhere to fit them. But I have really enjoyed reading them both. So Fulong's is called Creating Chinese Urbanism, Urban Revolution and Governance Change. So that was published last year. Le-Yin's was published about 18 months ago. So our excuse for not launching Le-Yin's book earlier was the pandemic. Blame everything on the pandemic. No, always industrial action. Blame it all on industrial action. So just say a few words about logistics. So we will be recording this event with a camera and, of course, audio recorder, but only the presentations and my comments and questions. Then we will stop recording for the question and answers. So feel free to ask questions. There won't be any recordings here if that makes you sort of feel freer to ask questions or make comments. Can also remind you that we are holding a reception afterwards, sponsored by the DPU State and Market Cluster. That's the 3rd plug, Michael. How about that? And in the South Cloisters and the Wilkins building. So you go out to the building, turn left, go past under the little tunnel and go up to the 1st floor in the Wilkins building. And so please join us for that afterwards. That should be at hopefully about 7:45 or 7:50. So the way it will work is I've asked the 2 speakers to present their books. So Le-Yin will start, and this is the book, the title of the book, and then followed by Fulong. I will ask them a few questions which are about really reflecting on their experiences as scholars working on China, looking back at the 50 years of change in China, which is really what the title of this dialogue, of this conversation is, and a few others before I open it to the floor. So just to introduce our speakers, and as I said, I'm really delighted and honored to be here with them. Le-Yin is Professor of Urban Economic Development at UCL's Bartlett Development Planning Unit. While her main professional interests lie with urban economies and urban economic development strategies in developing countries, she's a keen observer and long-standing researcher of post-Mao socio-economic transformations in China and the arts of government that underpin these transformations. Her most recent book, I've just introduced it, investigates China's performance in making the low-carbon transition since the mid-2000s, and how changing Chinese governmentality in general and concerns with carbon in particular have bolstered this performance. Le-Yin is also, as I said, a prolific writer. So in addition to articles, she's published books like Managing the City Economy, Challenges and Strategies in Developing Countries, which comes out of her long-standing lecture series on the same topic at the DPU, and the Finance for City Leaders Handbook, which was co-edited and is published by UN Habitat in Nairobi. Professor Fulong Wu is Bartlett Professor of Planning and a joint coordinator of the China Planning Research Group at UCL's Bartlett School of Planning. His research interests include urban development in China and its social and sustainable challenges. His book, Planning for Growth, Urban and Regional Planning in China, from 2015, provides a new interpretation of state-centered urban development and governance in post-reform China. He received the Outstanding International Impact Prize from UK ESRC in 2013. His new book, which I've just mentioned, which is, by the way, freely downloadable from UCL Press, reveals the profound impacts of marketization on Chinese society and the consequential governance changes at the grassroots levels. Both are terrific reads. I would recommend them, and I'm delighted that we're here with them. So thank you very much, Le-Yin and Fulong. So Le-Yin, can we start with you? So you may want to grab one of these and move there, because that I couldn't get that to work. So maybe grab one of the others.
Thank you very much, Julio. Thank you. Is this okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julio, for organizing this dialogue. It's a very good opportunity for me to talk about my work and other things. But it's a real honor, Fulong, to be here alongside you. So, hi. Good evening. I'm a bit nervous, you can see. Okay. But it's great to see so many of you here, and I can recognize many faces here. It's great. Now, before I get to my book, I feel I need to set my book in a broader context of China's transformation in the last 5 decades. So this is what I will do in the next 3 slides. The first slide shows levels of urbanization and per capita GDP in China over the 5 decades. So what you can see is that in 1972, this is when, in the beginning, okay, China was very, very poor. Per capita GDP was $132 US. Today, as 2022, this is more than 14,000 US. This shows that China today is 108 times richer than it was 5 decades ago. The other indicator is level of urbanization. At that point, in the beginning, 1972, the level of urbanization was just about 70%. Today is 65%. So China has really been transformed in socio-economic terms. The other change is actually decarbonization, which is more recent in the past decade. What this slide shows here is that both the total emission of China and the per capita emission, that is CO2 emission, okay, have nearly plateaued since early 2010s. So we are seeing more than just socio-economic transformation, but also decarbonization in China. The question really is that how such tremendous transformation comes about. And one possible way of discussing that is to perhaps start with some key moments. There are many key moments, but I have picked out perhaps 5 of these. In the very beginning, 1971 was a year when China, not China, let's say PRC, PRC gained membership of UN. 72 was a tremendous year in China because that year the US President Richard Nixon visited China, made that very historic really visit to China, and it changed everything. In that year, China and the US established their diplomatic relationship for the first time. PRC and the USA became somewhat partners. And in that first period, basically running through 72 to 78, 79, China was still in the depths of the Great Cultural Revolution. And China was still desperately poor. But by 1978 and 1979, China was moving into a very, very different era. Because in late 1978 and early 1979, China launched its historic, massive economic reform program. And this program was launched initially with the introduction of the household responsibility system, but many other changes followed. And what is interesting to note though is that China did not define clearly its objective of its economic reform program until 1992, when the 14th Party Congress defined the main aim of its economic reform program as developing a socialist market economy. Now, in this economy, primacy is given to the market for the first time in the allocation of resources. But the debate between the balance between planning and the market still continues today. But nevertheless, this was enormously significant change because it's given legitimacy to private sector, to market forces, to free enterprises. And the next very important turning point actually was 2001. That was the year when China gained WTO membership. Now, this membership led to tremendous industrialization in China because of the opportunity it created for China to export manufactured goods to all around the world. But this massive industrialization also had some very negative environmental consequences. It created literally an environmental disaster and a crisis. This then led to a rethink among the Chinese leadership, a rethink realizing that somehow China needs to change its mode of development. So that then started with the formal adoption of these two discourses called Scientific Outlook on Development, which emphasizes sustainable development, and the other one is ecological civilization. Now the latter is defined very clearly by the party. It is defined as to develop an resource efficient and environment friendly society and economy. So this actually, the 2007, post-2007 context is the context within which my book is set. So this is the introduction to the book, okay? So the book really was experimental in the sense that for the first time, I made experimental use of this new perspective. Well, for me, for the first time, right? The perspective is called governmentality. I never before actually used it. And part of the reason why I wrote the book for two purposes. One was to understand the decarbonization in the past decade, how that came about. The other one was trying to find out what I could do with a perspective like this if I were to use it to explore something like decarbonization. So there was this twin goals for me. Okay, so I need to say a little bit about governmentality because it sounds strange perhaps to quite a few of you here. Well, it would seem to me, I'm still developing my understanding of the perspective, by the way. But I found it's quite useful because in an authoritarian regime like China, whatever changes and achievements, transformation that have taken place, you cannot get away from asking, what did the state do, right? Because the state literally is the main leader, coordinator, orchestrator of all these different things. So I was looking for a perspective to study the state, basically. Now usually when we study the state, we kind of place a particular state according to large ideal types of state, such as liberal state, neoliberal state, or developmental state. But quite different from this approach, the governmentality perspective actually looks at the practice of government, or the art of governing. The so-called art of governing is about setting out collective goals and then find the means of achieving these goals. So it's all about how the state thought about goals, what goals to set, and then how to achieve them. And what is also interesting about this perspective is that it is actually less, although it allows the more brutal kind of power, mode of power, such as laws, regulations, and etc. But it is actually more interested in the more thoughtful, calculated means, such as disciplines, incentives, responsibilization. So give a responsibility to somebody. If you want to change their behaviors, give responsibility to them. So because of this kind of thinking ideas, I thought this is interesting, yeah? And let me use this particular perspective to examine how the Chinese state actually orchestrated decarbonization in China. So that was the initial thought. Now, there's a lot of details, but let me just very briefly talk you through a few key moments. So, as I was saying, that 2001 was the beginning of almost like the unraveling of the Chinese mode of development, because the membership of the WTO led to environmental problems. So by the first half of the first decade of the 21st century, there was already talk about finding alternatives. And initially, there was this idea called scientific outlook on development. Basically, it draws on the principle of sustainable development. And it was under that influence, China, first of all, for the first time, incorporated a mandatory energy intensity reduction target into its 11th five-year plan. Okay? And 2007 was a tremendously important moment because several things happened, at least three of this. Okay, the first thing was that the 14th Party Congress officially adopted the scientific outlook on development, okay, which actually kind of been discussed for quite a few years. And then the other thing was ecological civilization. It was also in that year, China published, as one of the first among the developing countries, the national program, a national program on climate change. So that was quite something. But for me, what was really important was the introduction of this responsibility system called Energy Conservation and Emission Reduction Target Responsibility System, abbreviation ECERTRS. So later on, I will refer back to that. The 2010 to 2016 basically were the first year of the 12th five-year plan and then the 13th five-year plan. What happened was that into these two later five-year plans were incorporated into further mandatory targets related to decarbonization. For instance, the first one was carbon intensity reduction, and then renewable energy targets were incorporated into 12. And the 16th, they went one step forward, but it was semi-formal. They actually introduced energy consumption cap on various units, jurisdictions, provinces, cities, even to urban district level. So in China, when something is done, it's like go all the way through. Okay, and these kind of various measures did have consequences, negative consequences for the economy. Actually, economy started to slow down from about 2016 onwards. And if you look into investments, you will see actually 2017 was a peak of China's investments into renewable energy. Because what happened is that with all these new targets, certain economic activities, mostly it's energy and emission intensive economic activities were being closed down, were cut, and were withdrawn investment, and so on. So that slow growth led to less revenue, less investment into renewable energy. Nevertheless, 2020 saw China announcing its new national contribution towards Paris Agreement, and basically announcing that China will peak its carbon emission by 2030 and then reach carbon neutrality by 2060. So that's are some of the key moments. I'm sure that you can already see that there's up and downs, okay? Now, to make sense of carbon governmentality or practices of carbon government in China, that is, plans, strategies, and programs that the government formulated and implemented for the purpose of decarbonization. I utilized a four-dimension framework by the DEAN. Well, this basically decomposed the art of carbon government in China into four main quarters. The first one is called fields of visibility. This basically asks the question like who and what to be governed, who to govern, what is the problem to be overcome, and what is the objective. Now, in my study, I identified 8 groups to be governed. On next slides, you will see the 8 groups. And who to govern? Well, very interestingly, in 2007 and 2008, the Chinese government introduced a dedicated department of climate change into the all-powerful NDRC, which stands for National Development and Reform Commission, which is actually a bit like a base in UK, but it's much more powerful because the way things are done in China and the UK are very different, right? And what then happens is that this structure is implemented right down to urban district level. So if you go to visit an urban district in China, you will find there's a dedicated section in many cities, okay, but probably not everywhere. A dedicated section which actually looks after decarbonization. So what was the objective? Was the main problem identified? was high carbon intensity, and the objective was defined as building a low carbon economy. So that was the first quarter. The second quarter is about knowledge. Now, what is peculiar with the governmentality perspective is its emphasis on knowledge, on the use and production of knowledge. Basically, it considers that if you are thinking about governing more effectively, right, translate your goal into objectives, everything you do has to be informed by knowledge. So how do they build knowledge? Well, that is really extraordinarily interesting. So, for instance, I realized that international partnerships were very much encouraged, nurtured, to generate together, to apply knowledge. So, local governments, for instance, utilized foreign expertise and also learned from other cities and so on in their development of low carbon development strategies and roadmaps, for instance. And many cities initiated routine-like calculation of emission inventories, working out what sectors are too emission intensive, therefore should be let go. So these are all knowledge-based. The third quarter is about changing identity. And it is about actually developing new kind of identities. So if they identified 8 groups, which I will show you on next slide, who are the 8 groups, the idea is you somehow, through various means, the government tried to turn them all into effective carbon managers. Obviously, the effort is not evenly effective, but nevertheless, this was what the government tried to do. Okay. The fourth quarter is rendering government technical, because governmentality pays a particular attention to the question of how. It pays attention to how you translate your thoughts, your political rationality, your knowledge into technical means so that your objective can be attained by changing people's behavior. And how do you change their behavior? You do so through technical means. Okay? So there were various techniques and government technologies introduced, but I do not have all the time to spell them out. I will try to give you a sense. So let me first of all perhaps go to who were governed. Well, I identified 8 groups, and but realizing that the greatest emphasis were placed on the first 3 groups. The first one was actually subnational governments and the top official group. The second is the major energy users. The third is financial institutions. Okay. So for financial institutions, there were legislations and there were incentives for them to develop green finance techniques. So China suddenly, from 2016, for instance, became #1 in issuing green bonds globally. And similar things. So I will leave that aside because I wanted to concentrate on what China did with the other 2 groups. Well, it mainly used this responsibility system, which I talked about earlier before, the energy conservation and emission reduction target responsibility system, because both groups were subject to this responsibility system. Well, under this system, annual contracts were signed between either between the central government and some national governments, that is, the provinces, or between provinces and cities, or between cities and urban districts. Okay? And it also covers the major energy users. So targets were set annually that they were supposed to do certain things, which were in accordance with the plan. And therefore, each of this group were putting under certain regime. You may be wondering, what about individuals? Well, individuals were also put under a certain regime. For instance, the government changed the law, which make individual citizens responsible for energy conservation in their consumption, for instance, but also to be rewarded for energy conservation behaviors, for instance. But there are further things. For instance, hospitals, I can give you an example, were economic incentives. So for instance, gas, in the hospital you use gas to cook, right? So they divided consumers into 3 tiers. If you were the top 5% gas consumers, hospitals, you pay 50% more in terms of prices per unit of gas. The next one was 90, 85, etc. So if you use more gases, you pay more per unit. So that was, and then there are various other kind of renewable energy. There's a energy levy, which provides subsidies and etc. But I don't think I have enough time, so I will very quickly move to my last slide. Okay. So this was the responsibility system. So basically what happens is that, earlier I already talked about the various 5-year plan incorporating mandatory targets for energy efficiency, for carbon reduction targets, for development of renewable energy, forestation. These are the main 4 areas that mandatory planning targets were imposed. So targets set at the national level. Then these targets, and it's set with a 5-year plan framework. And then these targets are disaggregated to the provinces and then go down to prefecture, cities, urban districts. Also, this is disaggregated along industrial lines, like steel industry, energy generation industry, etc. Okay? And what is more is that this 5-year plan then is worked out into annual plans. Therefore, it becomes it becomes easier to monitor. So there's an annual monitoring mechanism. And what happens is that every year, performances of the major jurisdiction unit are assessed and evaluated into, I believe it's 4 or 5 grades. For those who fail to meet the annual targets, there's a real sanctions. So the sanctions are various kinds, okay? So for instance, it will affect promotion prospect for top leaders. And for regions, so if we are talking about a province or a city, the sanction will be that if you do not meet these targets, the first thing is that you, within a month, you have to report to come up with remedial measures. The other thing is that if you have not met the target, it means that you cannot apply for new investment projects or apply for new land uses. So there's a lot of barrier sit there. And at the individual level, individuals who do well can be rewarded. I found prize in Shanghai, for instance, up to something like 50,000 renminbi for being very good as an individual. And at the same time in Shanghai, at the district level, an official told me, official, not the top official, actually tells me that, working in this section, if their district does not meet the criteria, does not meet the target, they actually will lose their annual bonus. So you can see that there is a variegated kind of incentives and sanctions. So that was the system, and that's what I kind of found. I think I should stop here, but you are very welcome to ask me more detailed questions later.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julio, for organizing this event and asking to participate, and also to Le-Yin for your great and stimulating talk, which explained very well the changing governance in China. I'm going to talk about Chinese cities, and in particular, creating urbanism in China. And actually, I need to explain the writing of this book. During the lockdown in the pandemic, it was really depressing to observe infection rates, and death toll. I think it's not good to watch all these scores because they are not football scores, deserve constant attention. So I decided to be away from watching this kind of depressing news and start writing a book. Of course, I could not go back to China, so what I could do is to do a virtual tour back to the place I was born. And indeed, I think when we place Chinese cities in a big context, not just 5 decades, but even longer, probably 100 years or 150 years. And I think changing Chinese cities or urbanization in China, which Le-Yin has provided a very nice figure, really represent the fundamental change of Chinese society. In the late Qing dynasty, official Li Hongzhang deployed that we are seeing some fundamental change. His words is, in the past 3,000 years, a fundamental change has occurred. So what kind of fundamental change occurred? To him, probably is the intrusion of Western power and technology, because he really watched the ship moving by steam power along the Yangtze River. And I think, indeed, if we look at Chinese cities, the creating Chinese urbanism is a kind of fundamental change. And the change is really, it means China departs from rural society or rural China. A well-known, renowned sociologist and anthropologist, Fei Xiaotong, in his book, 乡土中国, or English title, From the Soil, the Foundation of Chinese Society, he described very well the organization principle of Chinese society. He developed a concept called 差序格局. It literally translates as the differential mode of association. Basically, he said, in rural China, everyone was closely related to each other, and their social relation, just like circles, made into circles. Just like you throw a stone into the lake, and you see the circles of water, and you stand in the middle, and you have closer relation with your family, then your tribe, and then ancestor, and then your fellow villagers, and the rest of society. And he described a very close relationship, indeed, in rural China as society of acquaintance. People knew each other, although their relations were differentiated, but they, however, were organized by this kind of relation into a mode and order. So the social order emerged, I think, spontaneously from that. And also, his description of rural China is not a contrast between rural and urban or ideal type of rural, because at that time, even in Chinese cities, you can find similar organizational principles. So the city didn't see the emergence of civil society or city-state described by Max Weber. He's really a cultural characteristic of Chinese society as a contrast between rural society versus market society, in his words, probably a Western society, where market principle dominates. And so, so in that sense, I think urbanization makes a huge change. But I'm not a political scientist. I'm an urbanist. So I study urban phenomena. So I tend to look at very local, micro, even smaller scale, very small to the residential neighborhoods. In the book, I basically told 4 stories about 4 types of neighborhoods. The first 2 neighborhoods, I have lived in this kind of neighborhoods. And the second, the third and fourth type of neighborhoods, I know living experience, but I studied them as a research object. This kind of neighborhoods are inner urban neighborhoods, and inner neighborhoods really maintained similar style even after Communist Revolution 1949, because the Chinese state aimed to develop industrial complex in the suburban area and largely left inner urban neighborhoods underdeveloped. So you can see it became deteriorated. And in that kind of inner neighborhood, you still find very close relations. Yeah. And housewives participated in neighborhood watch and into so-called residential communities served by household retired people and housewives. And so in the book, in novel, the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, and by Wang Yi, she described very well the kind of close relation and people just talking and gossiping. And gossiping really become a way of organizing and monitoring and develop a social moral order. And so in a way that the traditionalism remained. The second type is so-called work unit neighborhoods or danwei residential community. And this kind of community basically was built by the state-owned enterprises or institutes, and people just live there. If you like, UCL may build its own living quarter. Everyone live in that residential quarter, and it's really a great social mix, and everyone knows everyone very well. And in a way that American sociologist Andrew Warden described, this is kind of organic society. He described this as the communist new traditionalism. So it's a kind of new traditionalism maintain a tight social control, but not through modern technique of policing. Really, again, everyone knows each other, and state allocate housing and provide welfare and benefits. So in a way that it was a kind of organic societies, and therefore the working class depend upon the state. In this kind of traditional society, even after the socialist revolution, the state did not separate itself from the society. The state actually embedded in the society, and they were closely embedded. So in a way that the state was less visible. So actually the political control was not necessarily through policing. Police knock your door. Not that. probably is your neighbor if you say something wrong. Yeah. Okay. Then, since China opened its door and initiated economic reform, you have seen another two types of new community: urban villages or informal settlements built by villagers themselves. So that was a village spontaneously extended by villagers, and to accommodate the rural migrants who are workers for China's the workshop of the world or the global factory. And cheap rental, but actually it's not cheap, because if you measure per square meter, it was more expensive. It was cheap because you can subdivide. It provides very small kind of units for migrant renters, workers who can afford the total smaller size. Also, this kind of, but in a minute I'll explain what has changed in these four types of communities. The fourth type is gated community, but it's not American gated community in that way. It is so-called 封闭小区, or literally translated as sealed residential compound. So quite similar, but what this kind of gated community is to accommodate middle class. Really, I believe that because middle class were at that time really fed up by constant political struggles, they want to retreat to themselves. They don't want to participate in social kind of affair. Really, they emphasize privacy. Yeah. So you can't knock people's door in that kind of community, and also they want better services instead of really poor service provided by workplaces, their employer. They want high level services maintained by professional property management companies. So you can see highly decorated, and when you walk along this, you can even listen to classical music played by hidden speakers inside the classes. So it's a kind of very good environment. But why they move away from this kind of community to that kind of community? They seek high quality built environment. They seek residential privacy. They are not seeking self-governance as American kind of gated community. We community organize themselves. Okay, now quickly I'll talk about changes in this four types of community. This is nice community, but actually it's not original 新天地, which actually was, most of them were demolished, and land use has been transferred from residential to commercial uses. Other type of this kind of old neighborhoods experience total demolition, disappear, relocation, and indeed, middle class deserted this kind of community. They want that kind of community, so they move away if they are affordable, the new housing. So you have seen residualization. Poorer people stay there and waiting for the community to be demolished. And also you see high level of mixture, and the atmosphere of this kind of a community really experienced downturn. It's dismantled. It has been dismantled, waiting for demolition in order to get better composition. For workplaces, workplace no longer provide services in terms of housing benefits or whatever. And also you see people relocated from inner areas to suburban gated communities. So a decline social engagement. Yeah. And for urban villages, villages spontaneously develop their house to earn rental income. And migrants there did talk to each other, neighboring, because it's easier, yeah, because they share kitchen sometimes, so it's a very informal living environment. But actually, migrants could not build their own communities. They are just renters, they are guests. If you can't afford a rent, you go. That's it. And they don't have chance to participate in neighborhood affairs, neighborhood activities. And villagers sometimes organize themselves into shareholder companies. So they are actually investors and to look after the assets. And so in a way that you can say it might be governed by so-called private governance. But actually that kind of private governance was really weak and not effective. So you can see they could not self-control themselves. They extended into some dangerous type of buildings, yeah, in terms of safety and also fire hazards and etc. So they actually did not, they were not able to manage it as a community of themselves. And the fourth type, a gated community, privacy is highly regarded. Residents there do have strong attachment to the place, but not because they engage with themselves, among themselves. They know each other. You don't know your neighbor, yeah, and you occasionally come across them in the compounds, but you keep a comfortable distance. And they have a common interest in property value, and they did organize themselves into so-called homeowners association. But their homeowners associations, originally, the government actually encouraged them, homeowners, to organize yourself to look after your properties. Yeah. However, when they become more powerful, the government began to impose some constraint on them to prevent homeowners organization evolving into a political organization. So there was not a kind of civil society, active civil society there, and it's more kind of homeowners association, more or less look after the property management, sometimes battle with property management companies. So basically you can see huge changes. So from this kind of changes, from this microscopic perspective, you can see a visible state emerging from China's urbanization or making Chinese urbanism. And in very earlier stage of economic reform, American sociologist Dávila said China was experiencing consumer revolution. And through the consumer revolution, you will witness urbanism. And from that, you will see a great choice, and then voluntarily a kind of organization which defend the interests of local people, and perhaps a civil society. And indeed, you may even see neoliberalism out of it. But in reality, the trajectory did not follow that kind of direction. Indeed, in the 2000s, China began to organize community construction to build a community. And it's a long-lasting movement. The way you can interpret it as a state want to maintain control. But more than that, actually it's very practical. You need to maintain social order. You need to provide services in a way that to maintain certain stabilities. What you have seen here, China is leaving the soil, leaving the foundation described by Fisher Tong of rural China or socialist China. Because in that time, the society was a totalized society. It's not, I wouldn't say it's a totalitarian because that describes the role of state. Really, the totalized means a comprehensive. People have really comprehensive relation built upon the differential mode of association. But now China is leaving the soil, and the foundation no longer there, and you will see the response of the state has to combat this kind of a huge impact of marketization of the development market in China. And you see consequential governance changes. And really, you see the separation between the state and society, and the end of state-society embeddedness. And therefore, you naturally see a visible state, a rising visible state. In a way that you can say authoritarianism, but more than that, it's kind of changing structure. And from there, I coined a governance feature in China is state entrepreneurism. The state, I think the idea is fairly similar to the governmentality. State, you use market actor to achieve certain state goals. And for example, ecological civilization might be a goal. Development, harmonious society may be a goal. But there are some goals to maintain political stability and legitimacy, etc. So I think what I try to explain is more kind of grounded how this kind of governance feature emerged from social changes. So that's it. So I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, fantastic. That's another wonderful presentation and reflection on what we're going to come to in a minute, which is the 5 decades of change, and you've given us a fantastic background there. I wanted to ask you first sort of both, maybe more Le-Yin than Fulong. In your definition of responsibility and also embedding responsibility within these changes, which are quite interesting, it makes me think of, I come from Colombia, and Latin America is particularly chaotic when it comes to that. I think it's very difficult to embed responsibility within Latin American society. So clearly there's something that it has to do with Chinese society, the 3,000 years that Fulong was mentioning. It's too early to just change in 3,000 years sort of thing. But there is a society that has kept together for thousands of years in pretty much the same territory, very organized, one of the wonderful civilizations of the world, which has produced extraordinary works of art and literature, and cities and architecture. And probably the oldest society in the world with India. But so that, where does that sense of responsibility come from? But how is it enforced? Neither of you mentioned the Communist Party of China in your talk. And I'm always intrigued, and everybody's intrigued who doesn't know China. Because there's a dance between the state and the Communist Party very clearly, and the Communist Party is very important, although not everybody is a member of the Communist Party, we know that. And nonetheless, it is a sort of an important actor in state. So where does the issue of responsibility come from? Is it ideological? Is it rooted in history? Is it enforced through the Communist Party principles? Where does that come from? I mean, how do we, other societies which are chaotic like mine, can learn from it, in other words?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Interesting question. I've been reflecting on it. What is interesting is that I did not show all my slides, but this idea of bearing responsibility and implementing and enforcing responsibility through contracting has been invaded in the Chinese way of organizing the economy for a very long time, actually, although it's a socialist. And initially, the initial debate, the cost of contracting, for instance, actually give rise to a very interesting metaphor you perhaps have all heard of. It's called the theory of the white cat and the black cat. Okay? Now, this metaphor has only become quite popular, I think, since maybe 1985, when New York Times magazine reported on Deng Xiaoping and quoting this theory, which basically says that regardless of the color of the cat, the good cat catches mice. Now, actually, it was much longer before. First time it was proposed by Deng Xiaoping, as you know, perhaps Deng Xiaoping is often described as a parliament leader who initiated economic reform program in late 1970s. But actually this theory he put forward was in 1962. And at that point, the main problem was that in the previous 3 years, China launched the so-called Great Leap Forward, which basically tried to turn everybody into industry worker. So they abandoned agriculture and made everybody to produce coal, to steel and stuff like that, iron and so on in the countryside. And then there was a great famine. So what then happened was to restore agricultural productivity. And there were two options, apparently. The first option was continued collective agriculture. Now, I actually lived in countryside, so I know what that means, but I'm not going to get into that. The other alternative was household contracting, basically giving piece of land to individual household and then setting like a quota for them to submit, well, not necessarily submit, sell grains or things like that, the main strategic agricultural produce, such as grains, cottons, and so on, to the state at a defined price, which tends to be relatively low. So you can see that this contracting idea was there from very early on. And then this contracting idea kept coming back. For instance, in late 1970s, early 1980s, the first thing the Chinese government did with its economic reform program was to introduce household responsibility system throughout the country. So previously it was like a temporary measure trying to restore agricultural productivity. But now this is the mainstay, and the system is in place for 50 years. So there is this responsibility. Now, the responsibility system I was talking about is in similar vein, but not the same thing, because there is a very important difference here. The difference is who are being contracted. In this case, the two main groups are the subnational governments on the one hand and enterprises on the other. So the main idea is that the targets are set for them through contracts. If they do not meet, and they need to take responsibility basically for meeting these targets. If they do not meet, there are sanctions. So that's my maybe a bit too long response.
No, it's good. Fulong, do you want to add anything to
Not so much, because I'm an urban geographer, so I'm not a political scientist, so I probably couldn't answer that question properly. But I noted that in China studies, scholars emphasize the role of party, and in my study I often refer to the state, but actually it's a party state, so I didn't distinguish the party and the state because they are actually the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think the role of party might strengthen the hierarchical feature because it is a multi-scalar, and so that probably prevent to some extent localism and of the government and the parties hierarchically organized in that way. But that is not a professional answer. I just don't know.
Okay, this one is.
Yeah, so I wanted to add to that. We need to realize how expanded the party system is. Basically, 1 out of every 20 people is a party member. You know, here we know that the Conservative Party only have about, if I remember correctly, is like 200,000 members, I think. But in China, we are talking about 1 every 20 people. Therefore, it is very much embedded into society. And when we talk about party, when we talk about state, we are referring to party state. Yes. They are the same.
Le-Yin, you said you didn't want to be drawn into a personal thing, but this is about you sort of prominent scholars of China, based in the UK, and I wanted to ask you 2 questions, which have to do with the title of this session, which is Reflections on 5 Decades of Change in China. You've done it through your scholarly work, which is extraordinary. But to what extent is being here in a UK university, and you were in Cardiff before coming to UCL, Le-Yin's been in UCL all your academic life, to what extent does it give you an advantage to look back and take distance? I ask as somebody who is, as I said, Colombian, who's looked at Latin America and Colombia in my own work, and I find that distance fantastically useful, but I lose out on the day-to-day issues. Well, I read newspapers, I talk to people and so on, but there's a limit to how much you can keep up. But at the same time, it gives you that sense of broadness, of putting things into its context, rather than being sort of embroiled in day-to-day issues which can be quite overwhelming. So you get a sense of a horizon and time, and you've been here most of your, if not all of your professional life. So how does that play into it, both of you? And Fulong.
Okay, yeah, I think I agree that there are both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that it forces you to observe from a distance, and something familiar. When you really want to explain, then you find it's difficult, and from a distance. And then you have other perspectives from the literature and from the textbooks, from the research articles published in other contexts, which force you to dialogue with different explanations and try to make sense of it. So that's an advantage. But disadvantage, as you said, it's remote sensing. It's long distance. But fortunately, before the pandemic, I was able to go back to China very frequently based on various research grants. But pandemic has changed everything. So I think it's a big damage on our research. On the other hand, I felt China is not too far. And you look at the research room, there are so many Chinese, maybe from China. So I learned quite a lot from my students, even my students, undergrads, and I'm not teaching undergrads, PhD students. For example, they raised up very concrete phenomena. So I knew a little bit new phenomena. But in order to explain that to them, to think together with them, and it helped me. So in a way that I'm helping students, but actually students help me in a way. I learned a lot from students in that way, engaging with students. And also we have a module on China, planning in China. So in that module we have very close debates about things, and which made me refresh my understanding.
Yeah, well, basically, I think like everybody who has left their home country to come to another country, and if they have come from remote corner of the world to the center of the universe, this is the kind of feeling I get, okay? In what sense? Well, it's the transition for me is extraordinary. So I grew up in a small town, and then I had the opportunity in late 1970s to go to Beijing to study. So that was already a huge change for me. And then I was lucky enough in 1988, actually, among the earliest to come out of China to come to study here. This is a tremendous opportunity, seriously. It changed everything. Everything's so different. And I can share with you that before I came to UCL, I did not even know there's such a thing as UCL. Yeah, because I had a scholarship, and my scholarship was handled by British Council, and they applied to DPU for me on my behalf. This is, I mean, it's incredible change, but what does that do? Well, it opens my eye, basically, yeah. But the contrast is hugely beneficial, because when I come here, I look at a world somehow using two different lenses. Sometimes I use the Chinese lens, the lens that I acquired in China, because I did my first degree in China and did part of a master degree in China. So I did have some sort of a lens. And then came here, I've been developing different lenses, getting familiarized with different lenses, and this is this contrasting. To be able to see the same thing from different angle is terribly useful. I cannot tell you how much it has changed me, and it's really fantastic. Like today is another such opportunities, to be here and to present our work and to be in dialogue with Fulong, with Julio, fantastic. Because if I did not come out, this would never happen, right? It changed everything, basically. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have two more questions, but you have to keep the answers brief. But I think it goes back to that sort of reflection of the 5 decades. So, what are your most enduring memories of change in China over the last 50 years? Because China has changed beyond recognition. I mean, you both gave us glimpses of that. But your personal memories of change, what are they?
Fulong wants to
Go ahead.
Okay, I can start, but I have a problem because I have many different memories. But strangely, maybe it's an indication of being old. Okay, the more distant memory actually is fresher. Okay, so my earliest memory maybe is about impoverished countryside in China in early 1970s. As it so happened that in late 1960s and early 1970s, so actually between 1969 to 1972, I spent 3 years as an early teen in a village of about 50 households. And it was absolutely impoverished. It's all very beautiful because it's part of Zhejiang, green hills, rivers along the village and so on. But the village was prone to flooding, and we did not have enough to eat, seriously, by end of certain seasons. And one thing I remember very clearly is that most children did not wear shoes. So we walked barefooted for many months of the year. And that was real, but it also, there was something else. I learned a great deal, but only after I came out, when I remember what it was about. This was about collective agriculture. So groups of men and women were divided into small groups and were given tasks to perform. And then they earn work points. And for a full adult man, they will get 10 work points for 1 day's work. But what do they earn? They earn 0.3 renminbi, which is about 13 cents, US cents, okay? 13 cents at that time. So really, it wasn't enough to even purchase the grain allocation from the collective. And what else do they have to generate cash for buying essentials like salt, for instance? What they relied on chickens, laying eggs. So there's only one little store in the village where you can buy essentials and you can sell your eggs. So that's what we did. So that was the beginning of the 50 years. Okay. Now, and there are some other very graphic memories as well. For instance, when I went to Beijing for the first time to go to university, that was the first time I used the train. Never before I used the train. And it took 19 hours for me to travel from Hangzhou, that's the capital of Zhejiang province, actually one of the richest provinces in China. 19 hours for me to travel from Hangzhou to Beijing. But a few years ago, when I went back to China to visit, I realized now with the high-speed train, it only takes 5 hours. That is the kind of scale of change we are talking about. So really, literally, miracle kind of things have happened. And I think for many years and many decades to come, we will continue to reflect upon this sort of changes. And I feel very privileged to share this sort of memory with you. But I think we have to study this phenomenon.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. The most enduring changes in China, to me, probably is the making of Chinese cities, or the emerging cities, and the creation of urbanism. And although I lived in city before, in the neighborhoods in Shanghai, for example, and I didn't really live in cities. And now when I go back and I can see the changing urban landscape and profound changes of social relations. But on the other hand, I think as scholars, we love to portray changes, shift, because that's interesting, yeah? If you say no changes, it's not interesting. But despite profound changes, now I gradually realized some continuation and persistences. So I want to situate this kind of changes in a longer history to see what has been kept same or continuation. So in a way that China is still quite different, but China returns to the world, and what you have seen China today is actually, I would say, normalization. China joined the modern society, and so my way of interpreting the state is, rather than call it authoritarianism, is to see the natural emergence of a professionalized state, and in that context of making cities.
Great, thank you. had another question, but I'm terrified it will such a big question that it may elicit long answers, which are wonderful. And so I don't want to curtail you, but I also want to open it to thought. My question is, but if you tell me if it's too big, China lost, according to demographers, about 800,000 people last year. So it shrank by 800,000 people last year. But also according to several articles, including this article by The Economist from a couple of weeks ago, Chinese cities are in trouble, or several Chinese cities are in trouble. Now, you never know when, writers like The Economist sort of put things into perspective. I respect them, but I don't know enough to say, well, actually, is this generalizable? In the sense that, they're facing a huge debt burden. They've sold off the land that sort of gives them money to keep going. And they've taken, trillions of dollars in debt. So, what is the future of urban China? Small question. We can leave it for the drinks afterwards, I think. Just a quick question.
I think this is a very interesting question, and the debt issue, and that relates to so-called financialization. So with my two PhD students, we are doing work on financializing Chinese cities, and my argument is like this. Basically, if you see so state entrepreneurs, is that state use financial means, including mobilizing capital from land and to finance modernization of China and to achieve state strategy. And that kind of operation runs into its own problem or contradiction long before the decline of total population. So population decline may actually accelerate the prices, debt prices, but it's well before that. And it depends on how China could manage this. But the urbanization will continue, and you will see continuation of rising urban population, income structure.
Yeah. Okay. Now about population loss or population shrink. It's tragic, I think. One of the interesting things is that the carbon, I use the governmentality to study decarbonization in China, right? During my research, I realized the earliest instance when governmentality was applied to study Chinese affairs was actually about the one-child policy in China. It was one of the earliest pieces where governmentality was applied to study a Chinese issue. And what is intriguing is for me to realize it's a similar system which led to decarbonization was applied to control population growth. They rendered that policy technical. For instance, biological cycles, women's cycles were studied, quota were allocated to different provinces, cities, districts, even township and street communities. So every detailed calculation was made to ensure that policy was effective. And in the end, it was extraordinarily successful. Because now China's natural birth rate is among the lowest in the world. What this contrast made me to think is that the governmentality is actually quite, in a way, quite dangerous too. Because if you apply it for the wrong purpose, you could create a huge problem for yourself in the future. Now the decarbonization, I don't think is the case, but maybe the one-child policy is of that kind. Having said that, I tend to be still cautiously optimistic about urban China, because I feel that over all these years, the reform and various new think about new sustainable, more sustainable mode of development and making changes about institutionalizing the pursuit of ecological civilization and so on. One spirit does permit all these different attempts. That spirit actually, I suddenly realized some years ago in Shanghai, when we went to have a workshop with the top leader actually in the Developmental Research Center in Shanghai. By the way, one of their top leaders actually is a DPU alumni. So we had this workshop, and they told us, I wasn't the only one, Professor Bishop from Bartlett School was there as well. And what expression they used about urban planning, okay, because we exchanged lessons about urban planning in UK and Chinese context. And one of the expressions they said was very simple. They said their main motivation is to make people satisfied. 要让人们满意. That was the 要让人民满意. So that was the Chinese expression. And I feel that this is the spirit of the Chinese Communist Party actually. Regardless how powerful the party state is, it still considers as its obligation to improve the standard of living for China and to do good things for the country. So in that sense, my feeling is that whatever problem there's going to be, the party state will somehow get onto it and keep it going. At least for some time. Okay. So that's what I feel.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for a really fascinating, insightful, personal and scholarly overview of what is a wonderful world that I wish to see at some point. You're all invited to the drinks in Wilkins building, in the South Cloisters, to the left. People will direct you there if anybody knows the South Cloisters, just outside the Provost's office. So thank you, Fulong. Thank you, Le-Yin, for